Well, we are going to start. I'm very pleased to be here. Once more, I think I am totalist since the beginning of these encounters, which is for me a great pleasure. I have the honor to have here Ambassador Anna Martin, my friend since many years. Well, I'm going to pass, but I thank you, Professor Zabenobo-Rose. It's always a great pleasure to have you between us. Also Mark Plattner, and I'm going to ask Ambassador Anna Martin to begin our works. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. A special good afternoon to the students that are attending the forum. And thank you, Professor Guilherme Oliveira Martins, an old friend, for introducing me to start really this session that we want to keep concise and really on schedule so that everybody has the time to speak. But I must say that it is a privilege to me to be here, and I would very much like to thank the Estoril Political Forum in the person of Professor João Carlos Espada, Director of the Institute of Political Studies, for inviting me. It must be congratulated. I must stress this because this is the 30th anniversary of the Institute. I realize it's a Millennium Institute, so congratulations. And after very demanding restrictions and isolation due to the pandemics, with challenges that the organization met with flying colors, here we are back, meeting in person in this wonderful setting, Cascais, Estoril. There is nothing like it, and I must look at Rita Soares Brito for the great job that she always does, putting all this together. So, the theme of this session is Confronting the Authoritarian Challenge, also the title of the 30th edition of the forum. As you see in the program, Ambassador Ina Onivets, our guest of honor, cannot be with us, much to her regret, because she is the head of the Ukrainian delegation to the conference, to the Oceans Conference. And as we start our work, she is addressing the I segment of the conference. Always generous and willing to reach out, she immediately sent a video message. And so I will now give the floor virtually to Ina Onivets for an opening video statement.
Excelentíssima Senhora Doutora Isabel Capiola Gil, reitora da Universidade Católica Portuguesa. Excelentíssimo Senhor Dr. Carlos Carreiras, presidente da Câmara Municipal de Cascais. Excelentíssimo Senhor Dr. João Carlos Espada, diretor do Instituto de Estudos Políticos da Universidade Católica Portuguesa. Queridos estudantes presentes, senhoras e senhores. Em primeiro lugar, gostaria de agradecer o convite para participar nesta discussão. É para mim uma grande honra dirigir-me aos participantes do Fórum Político do Estoril sobre um tema tão atual: resistir ao desafio autoritário. Infelizmente, devido a uma agenda preenchida, não posso comparecer pessoalmente no evento, mas estou convencida de que o mesmo será um sucesso. Como sabem, pelo quarto mês consecutivo, a Ucrânia tem resistido à agressão russa e às hostilidades que estão a decorrer no coração da Europa. numa escala comparável apenas à Segunda Guerra Mundial. As mortes de crianças ucranianas aumentam a cada dia, como resultado da agressão russa na Ucrânia. 324 crianças já morreram e mais de 592 ficaram feridas. Imaginem tais números. A perda de cidadãos ucranianos tão jovens, o sofrimento das crianças feridas, a dor dos seus pais e parentes. Para além das crianças, foram mortos dezenas de milhares de civis e muitos outros ficaram feridos. Cerca de 220 mil pessoas perderam as suas casas. Mais de 18 mil instalações e infraestruturas civis foram destruídas e danificadas, incluindo estradas e pontes, instalações educacionais e médicas, redes de água e pontos de eletricidade, assim como locais culturais e religiosos. A pior situação humanitária permanece nas povoações ao longo da linha da frente e naquelas que estão sob a ocupação russa. A cidade de Mariupol foi praticamente destruída por ataques russos e sofreu dezenas de milhares de perdas e deportações forçadas pelos ocupantes russos. Roubos, torturas, assassinatos premeditados e sequestros são comuns nos territórios ocupados. Quase 12 milhões de cidadãos da Ucrânia ficaram temporariamente deslocados. Mais de 6 milhões estão no exterior. A Ucrânia deve vencer no campo de batalha. A vitória da Ucrânia será uma vitória para toda a Europa, a qual será muito mais segura e confiável quando a máquina militar russa for desmantelada. Temos todo o direito de contar com o fornecimento de armas, que nos ajudará a obter uma vantagem na frente de combate. Podem ter a certeza de que a Rússia continua focada na guerra, não na diplomacia. Ela está a preparar-se para uma guerra prolongada, na expectativa de que a ajuda à Ucrânia seja enfraquecida pelo cansaço da guerra. A Ucrânia, como apoio dos nossos parceiros, lutará até vencer. Não concordaremos com um conflito congelado. A nossa vitória significará a restauração da soberania e integridade territorial da Ucrânia, dentro das suas fronteiras internacionalmente reconhecidas. Essa abordagem também é apoiada pelos nossos parceiros ocidentais. Neste momento, quase 20% do território da Ucrânia está ocupado. De acordo com pesquisas de opinião pública na Ucrânia, 82% dos ucranianos não concordam com ceder territórios em troca da paz. Um cessar-fogo não pode ser um fim por si mesmo. Tentaremos retirar as tropas russas. A Ucrânia libertará os seus territórios com base no princípio da máxima preservação da vida humana. A Ucrânia agradece a decisão da União Europeia de impor um 6º pacote de sanções contra a Rússia. No futuro próximo, isso minará as oportunidades econômicas do Kremlin para financiar a guerra contra a Ucrânia. O 7º pacote de sanções da União Europeia, que já começou a ser preparado, deve incluir sanções setoriais sobre a energia, o setor financeiro e o comércio, a expansão das sanções pessoais e o bloqueio de todas as lacunas para contorná-las. A Rússia deve ser reconhecida como um Estado patrocinador do terrorismo e as Forças Armadas russas como uma organização terrorista. Saudamos todas as medidas tomadas pelas instituições internacionais para levar a Rússia à justiça, bem como as declarações de chefes de Estado e de governo de todo o mundo a responsabilizar a Rússia por crimes de guerra. Todas as violações do direito internacional e humanitário devem ser registradas por órgãos internacionais. Uma investigação separada sobre o crime de genocídio está a ser conduzida. O Tribunal Penal Internacional abriu a sua própria investigação em grande escala a pedido de 42 países e juntou-se a uma equipa de investigação conjunta da Ucrânia, Lituânia e Polônia. O isolamento diplomático e político da Rússia deve continuar até este país agressor termine a guerra sangrenta contra a Ucrânia e retire as suas tropas que ocuparam ilegalmente uma parte do meu país. A Ucrânia congratula-se com a decisão histórica do Conselho Europeu sobre a concessão à Ucrânia o estatuto de candidato à adesão à União Europeia. Esta decisão tem o significado simbólico, pois leva a Ucrânia a um caminho direto para a adesão à União Europeia, a adesão ao mundo ocidental livre e democrático. Concluindo o meu discurso, gostaria de assegurar aos participantes do Fórum Político do Estoril que a Ucrânia está interessada na restauração da paz e construção de um poderoso Estado europeu, futuro membro da União Europeia. Obrigada pela vossa atenção.
Though you are not listening to us, thank you, Ambassador. Listening to the remarks of our guest of honor, we receive a striking and strong message about the situation confronting the brave and sacrificed Ukrainian people, and in fact, with similar importance, confronting us, though we are spared the suffering that is going on that territory, on that country. The message of the Ukrainian people that is so courageously fighting for freedom and democracy is not only about their country, for they have also taken upon themselves to defend and uphold our own freedoms and values. What we all stand for, a community of democracies. I would like to thank you, Ambassador, again, for the enduring courage of your people that we wholeheartedly support. The invasion of Ukraine without total violation of international law, disrespect for the sovereignty and integrity of the territory of an independent country is unacceptable, must be condemned and must be stopped. And it must remain number one of our concerns. When we woke up on the 24th of February, the world had changed. It meant a turning point with far-reaching and deep structural geopolitical implications. Taken by surprise, we asked, most of us, asked ourselves, how did we get there? At least I did. And it seems now already ages ago. This is what I think is at the crux of our debate, demanding clear, strong positions and action. This panel gathers very distinguished speakers that are well known to all of you. I have the honor to share this afternoon session with Dr. José Manuel Durão Barroso, Prime Minister of Portugal, former Prime Minister of Portugal, former President of the European Commission, Director of the IEP-UCP Center for European Centers, and Mark Plattner, founder, co-editor, Journal of Democracy, Washington, D.C., Chairman of International Advisory Board, also William Galston, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institutions, collaborator with the Wall Street Journal, and that was assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy. I would like to set very briefly some more ideas about our topic and taking it from there, address the panelists an open question. Over the past decade, illiberal powers have globally become emboldened and gained influence. Leading authoritarian countries have developed new tools and strategies to contain democracy and challenge the liberal international political order. Undemocratic regimes, some coming to power through elections, became more assertive, working to repress civil society while tightening their grip on political system, on cyberspace, expanding their reach, namely in international media, undermining democracy. Meanwhile, the advanced democracies have retreated, became defensive, failing to respond or confront the threat posed by authoritarian trends, allowing international organizations and multilateralism to become weaker, failing to take up the challenge. The question that we raise today has been for the past years, one way or the other, at the heart of the agenda and the concerns of the Estoril Political Forum: how to confront the authoritarian challenge. The answer has become more and more urgent, and suddenly it is a vital one. It's no longer rhetorical, it is a brutal reality. What to do to counter and disengage this trend that is increasingly and dangerously spreading, gaining ground to shape the world. How to advance in building our future, the future of our children and grandchildren, for those that already have them, this is my case. How to better shape globalization, for I believe that globalization is not dead, it will continue, and how to strengthen multilateralism, indispensable to dialogue and diplomacy. Inevitably, and summing up, how to confront the authoritarian challenge. Seeking answers, I think, brought us together in this unique Estoril Political Forum. And this is the question that I would like to turn to our distinguished speakers to address and debate. I am sure that they will be able to enlighten us with their views and wisdom. So I would kick off the session and debate, giving the floor to José Manuel Durão Barroso. Thank you.
Querida Ana, dear Ambassador Ana Martinho, thank you very much for your introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here once again in this Estoril Political Forum. What a great event this is. It's really amazing that we are now in the 30th edition of this event. I really want to congratulate very sincerely the Instituto de Estudos Políticos, Professor João Carlos Espada, my dear friend, also the director of the Estoril Political Forum, Professora Rita Seara de Brito, all my colleagues at the Instituto de Estudos Políticos, since I have the privilege also of being a visiting professor there and also director of the Center for European Studies, and really to have a special message to the students of our Instituto de Estudos Políticos for your participation, your engagement. You make it a success. I'm also delighted to be in such great company in this panel, and without trying to waste my time, I'm going directly now to the subject. So, because we have several speakers and we have very important topics to discuss. The question is confronting the authoritarian challenge. So what can we do to have success in this endeavor? First of all, there is Ukraine. Just think for a while what will happen if Russia gets what they do, gets what they want, if they attain their objective, that is basically not accepting the very existence of Ukraine as a sovereign country. It is also not accepting Ukraine as an independent player in an international area, either in defense or in international affairs. As some of you know, I've met President Putin many, many times. According to my office in the European Commission when I left, because there was a statistic, I met him 25 times. I'm not especially honored because of it, but the reality is that we had at that time, twice a year, summits with Russia, with the Federation of Russia. And also, I met him in bilateral meetings, not only when he was president, but when he was prime minister, and also in meetings in the margin of the G8 and the G20. At that time, before the annexation of Crimea, as you know, Russia was a member of the G8. So one question I'm asking myself for a long time is why? Why is this happening? What an absurd move. Because in fact, also for Russia, I do not believe this is an intelligent move. I believe it's a mistake from a strategic point of view for Russia, not only economically, diplomatically, and politically. But the reality is, and we have to come here to the authoritarian mind, authoritarianism is closer to absurdity than democracy. Preparing this talk today, I came to one of my favorite thinkers of all time, in fact, Baruch de Spinoza, or Bento de Spinoza, and trying to translate from Latin, he said in his theological political treaty, in a democratic state, there are less reasons to fear absurdity, since it's almost impossible for the majority of men united in some kind of a whole entity to agree on an absurdity. The second reason is that it's also less to fear this absurdity because of the very basis and goals in a democracy, which are nothing less than make men free from the absurd domination of desire and to keep them as much as possible in the limits of reason so that they can live in harmony, that's how I translate concordia, and peace. If this basis is not kept, all the construction crumbles. Very free translation of Spinoza, but I think it comes to a very central point. The absurd decisions of an authoritarian, autocratic system like current Russia. So what can we do to confront the authoritarian challenge? First of all, support Ukraine. Support Ukraine politically, diplomatically, economically, in a humanitarian way, but also militarily. That's what we have been doing, basically. When I say we, I mean the Western countries, namely European Union and our American friends, but also other important partners as well. This is basically what we have been doing. This is a very important way if we want to confront the authoritarian challenge. I know there are some costs and there are some challenges there, but politics is always about the counterfactual. Let's think for a minute that you don't do it. Let's imagine that Russia gains all their objectives. I think it will be a disaster, not only, first of all, for the Ukrainian people, for the tragedy they are living there, but it will be also a disaster for Europe and for the global order we want to live in. So the costs of inaction are much higher than the costs of our strong, committed solidarity with Ukraine. That is my first point. But what is at stake? Is it just about democracy? Yes and no. It is about democracy, but it's more than that. It's about the global order. It's about the very respect of international law, and some essential principles like the respect of national sovereignty, national independence, territorial integrity. So what is at stake is, in fact, the challenge to the order that, without being perfect, was built after the Second World War, basically by the so-called West, basically by the United States. The reality is that, for some reason, the United Nations have their headquarters in New York, or the IMF and World Bank in Washington, D.C. What we are seeing today is a challenge to this global order, a multilateral order that was basically created by the West, and those founding documents from Declaration of Human Rights to all the constructs, institutional constructs of that international order. So what's going on, it's much deeper than a fight between authoritarian regime and a democratic regime in the center of Europe. What are we doing? Is it enough? I believe that from a European point of view, we should be relatively proud of what we've been doing. The reality is that Europe is changing dramatically because of these developments. I think, by the way, that the world is no longer the same after the 24th of February this year. And we are only seeing the first effects of this huge transformation. The first consequences of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's Russia are the demand of Finland and Sweden to join NATO. That would be unthinkable some months ago. If any one of us was speaking about this some months ago, is Finland, a neutral country, going to join NATO in the near future? People say, are you going crazy? This is simply not possible. But now it is possible. And I believe they are going to join Finland and Sweden, in spite of the position of Turkey, that I'm sure and I hope they will be able to change in the not distant future. That's the first consequence of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Second, not so much spoken, is a very interesting development, is a referendum where a huge majority of the Danish people supported Denmark joining the European mechanism of security and defense. As you know, Denmark until now had an opt-out for that. And now Denmark, well, almost 70% voted in a referendum that they want to be part of the European security and defense identity, seeing it not as opposing, but as complementing the transatlantic alliance. As you know, Denmark is already a member of NATO. Another important consequence is granting candidate status to Ukraine, candidate status to the European Union, and also to Moldova. Moldova, which I believe deserves a lot of attention because it's at the epicenter also of a region that may know further turbulence. So these are some consequences for Europe. But more importantly, and you allow me to spend some time on the European Union because of my experience there, what's going on is much, much deeper than that. Some years ago, it would be unthinkable for the European Union countries and the European Union as an institution to provide lethal support, military support, to a zone in conflict. And what's happening, namely in Germany, it's unprecedented. I'm saying that because some of our friends in the United States or sometimes in Britain have a temptation sometimes to underestimate the magnitude of the change in Germany. But we have to understand that the position of Germany was not the same as, for instance, the United Kingdom, because of their relationship with Russia, and also because of the aftermath of the Second World War, where we saw from Germany towards Russia some attitudes of complacency and complicity. But now, this has changed. Germany is a very big ship. It takes some time to change, but when they change, they change. And that's going on, and there will be no coming back to the situation before. So this is a major development, because now the European Union is supporting militarily a country in a conflict, financially and militarily. I remember, let me just share this experience of mine when presenting the budget of the European Union to the Parliament and to the Council of Ministers, to the European Council also. for the period 2014-2020, it was my commission put forward, I suggested that some funds for research, the so-called Horizon 2020 program, it was 80 billion euros, some of it could be spent in what we call dual technology. Technology that could have civilian but also military use. And I said it because I thought it was a useful way of spending that money, because we know of the most important synergies that exist between the defense industry and some very advanced areas of technology. It was completely rejected by the European Parliament. I was almost accused of being an ultra-militarist because I was violating the great principle of the European Union as just a civilian power. At that time, I said that for me, with all respect for the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, the European Union cannot be seen just as a supranational organization of Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. We need to be serious about defending our interests, certainly in the respect of our values, but we have to be firm defending our very interests. Today, the European Parliament is supporting, in fact, is asking more from the governments in terms of military aid to Ukraine. And the interesting irony of this is that the Greens in Germany, that traditionally were the pacifists, die Grüne, those were more opposed, for instance, to the deployment of some nuclear weapons in Europe to contain the Soviet Union. Now they are among those who are biggest champions of a stronger attitude towards Russia. You see how the world changes. So what's going on in Europe is a major, major change. And also, it's going on together with the United States and our partners of NATO. And I can testify, because of several contacts I've been keeping, that I think there is, this moment we are living now is one of the best moments in the history of European-American relationship. Completely different from the moments we were living some time ago with the previous President of the United States of America. But today, the level of understanding, of complicity, of coordination, of cooperation between the United States of America and the European Union is certainly a much better moment than others we have known in the not-so-distant past. But globally, are we gaining the argument globally? I'm sorry to say it's more difficult. The reality is that sometimes in the West, we underestimate the resentment, the deep resentment that exists against the richer countries, some democratic countries, former colonial powers as well. And this is having some consequence in the global landscape. It's true that in the resolution that was put forward in the United Nations General Assembly, 141 countries voted on our side against Russia. Yes, 141 countries, 50 more than had condemned before the invasion of Crimea by Russia. But at the same time, we see that some of the biggest democracies in the world, namely the biggest democracy in the world, India, has abstained. Country, another democracy, member of the BRICS, South Africa, has abstained. And of course, China, not a democracy, but one of the two biggest countries in the planet, has abstained. So, and some of countries that are closer to us, for instance, here in Portugal, from Angola to Mozambique, they have abstained. African countries, that I believe they should have supported the right of self-determination of Ukraine, because those countries that have fought, not in the distant past, colonial rule, I think they should support the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of a country like Ukraine. So I think there is some work to do there. And sometimes I think this is a lack of confidence that we show in the West about our own civilization, our own values. While others are now restoring their history, restoring the pride in their previous civilization, today in Europe, and I would say probably in the West as a whole, sometimes you are afraid of mentioning our history, of mentioning our values, of mentioning, why not to say, our civilization. Of course, it reminds me of the great scholar, American scholar Samuel Huntington, when he spoke about the clash of civilization. I'm afraid that at least partially he was right. And we are now facing something that is deeper than a conflict between democracies and authoritarian regimes, we are also facing some kind of struggle between different civilizations. Just think about the BRICS. The BRICS, the only one voted with us, it was Brazil, by the way. All the other BRICS, I mean, Russia, of course, they were supporting their own position, but all the others have abstained. So we have some work to do globally if we want to confront successfully the authoritarian challenges. First of all, support Ukraine, as I said, but also think about what we can do to restore multilateralism, to restore the international order, or at least to adapt it based on the principles that are so important for us. Finally, and that requires some self-criticism, we have to see what we can do as homework for our democracies. Our democracies are far from perfect. And for instance, here in Europe, we have seen recently some arguments about illiberal democracy. I don't think some illiberal democracies are in a position to teach others how best to defend the true values of liberal democracy, because liberal democracy is the only form of democracy I can think of. This is an important issue. And also, if you want to be critical, for instance, I have to say that, I don't think, for instance, what happened in Washington in the 6th of January, the invasion of the Capitol, or the mass shootings in the United States of schools and kids is the best propaganda we can have for democracies. And this is being used by our opponents. If you read the Chinese media, if you read, they are putting in question all the time the values of democracy because of some failures of our democratic systems. And we have to be honest, we have problems in our democracies. So if we want to succeed in the global struggle about the arguments for democracy, we have also to have some modesty. We have to be proud about what our democracy have achieved along the years, about our social market economy, for instance, in Europe, about the values of freedom and democracy. But at the same time, we have to be self-critical about some things that are not going the proper way in our democracies. Democracy, and I use an expression of Montaigne, not about democracy, but about life, about le jardin parfait. Democracy is an imperfect garden that requires constant, careful tending. And this is, I think, my final message. To confront the authoritarian challenges, besides now supporting fully our friends in Ukraine, we need to do everything we can to support the global international order based in our common values and principles, but we need also to look self-critically to our democracies and to see where we have failed and what we can do to make them better. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, José Manuel, and thank you for keeping your time with such a rich intervention that sets the tone in a very forceful and interesting way, trying to already open some windows for answers. And taking it from this rich set of ideas, I will next try and invite my partner to share his remarks with us. Thank you.
Is this working?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. That was a very eloquent presentation. Mine perhaps will be a little more academic, but not very. But I do want to begin with a few thoughts about the title, both of this session now and the conference as a whole, namely Confronting the Authoritarian Challenge. Now, one thing this brief phrase doesn't do is explicitly indicate who must confront the challenge. The answer to this question can be left unstated because it's taken for granted. Those facing this challenge are, of course, the world's liberal democracies. Now, the authoritarian challenge to liberal democracy has two key dimensions. It is in part a geopolitical or security threat, but it's also a competition in the realm of political principles, values, and ideas. And while it's sometimes helpful analytically to treat these two dimensions separately, they're very closely intertwined, and their interrelationship should not be overlooked. The key word in our title is authoritarian, and it's worth briefly tracing how the meaning of this term has evolved over the past few decades, in fact. During the Cold War, the term authoritarianism was used most often as a contrast with totalitarianism. The eminent political scientist Juan Lintz wrote an important book in 1975 entitled Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes. And the basic distinction that Lintz drew was between regimes like those of the communists and Nazis, which sought total control over all facets of social and political life, and regimes that were autocratic but were willing to leave their people some spheres of independent activity. President Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, built upon this difference in a famous 1979 article entitled Democracy and Double Standards that focused on the features separating traditional right-wing authoritarian regimes from revolutionary communist totalitarian regimes. But since the end of the Cold War, the meaning of the term authoritarian has gradually widened to encompass all forms of non-democratic government. So today, even countries that once unquestionably would have been labeled as totalitarian are commonly referred to as authoritarian, a category that now embraces regimes as different as those of Singapore and North Korea. And I should also mention here the word autocratic, which is another label that's widely applied to non-democratic regimes. As far as I can tell, there's no significant distinction in current usage between the terms authoritarian and autocratic. The Biden administration, for example, seems to use autocracy and authoritarianism interchangeably in its speeches and documents. Now, beginning with his inaugural address, President Biden has regularly invoked the opposition between democratic and autocratic, or authoritarian if you prefer, countries. What's more, he has presented this divide as the crucial fault line of world politics, and hence a key to understanding U.S. foreign policy. One of the signature initiatives of his presidency has been the so-called Democracy Summit, aimed at fostering cooperation among democracies and enhancing their solidarity in the competition with authoritarianism. In his opening statement to the first Democracy Summit in December 2021, Biden called the defense of democracy, quote, the defining challenge of our time. And he reaffirmed this framing of the global struggle in his March 2022 Warsaw speech in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Biden spoke of, quote, the great battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rule-based order and one governed by brute force. So in fact, he included the issue that Dr. Barroso raised. And he noted that the forces of autocracy have revived all across the globe and issued a call for, quote, absolute unity among the world's democracies. And I think one can say that the Biden administration so far has done an impressive job of maintaining democratic unity within NATO and among other U.S. allies. But it's also been discovering anew how difficult it is to maintain such unity on a global basis. As the Biden team learned in dealing with the invitation list during the run-up to the inaugural Democracy Summit, it's often very difficult at the margins to determine which countries deserve to be included in the democratic camp. Efforts to create global democratic clubs have invariably been plagued by the question of their criteria for membership. Now, this problem had already been highlighted with the founding of the Community of Democracies in the year 2000. This intergovernmental organization, whose creation was spearheaded by U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Polish Foreign Minister Bronislaw Geremek, was launched with 106 countries approving its founding document, the Warsaw Declaration. 2 decades later, the Community of Democracies is still in business. It has a permanent secretariat and continues to hold regular meetings. But its website, while naming the states that compose its governing council, does not even list the organization's full roster of member states. In any case, I would say the Community of Democracy is little known in most of the world, and it's very hard to discern any significant impact that it's had on international politics. The problem of how to draw the boundaries for a club of democracies is something not easily resolved. If one draws the line strictly, it will lead to a group that is disproportionately Western and mostly European. But if one goes too far in the opposite direction, the direction of flexibility, the body that results will include countries whose democratic credentials range from dubious to laughable, undermining its legitimacy and thus its capacity to state the case for democracy. The principles that unite full-fledged or aspiring democracies are relatively clear. In his Warsaw speech, President Biden cited the rule of law, free and fair elections, the freedom to speak, to write, and to assemble, the freedom to worship as one chooses, and freedom of the press. By contrast, it's not easy to identify the principles around which the authoritarians are rallying. If one looks at the 2001 charter of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, probably the leading body founded by autocracies, Russia and China were its 2 key founders, one can find language endorsing the UN Charter, international peace and security, and even human rights and fundamental freedoms. But this document clearly gives pride of place to, quote, mutual respect of sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of states, and inviolability of state borders, non-aggression, and non-interference in internal affairs. A list of principles that its leading members conspicuously fail to heed in practice. Exhibit A is Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. Indeed, the bonds uniting the authoritarians at first seem somewhat mysterious. After all, the ideologies of the leading authoritarian states are wildly disparate. In Russia, a kind of updated Tsarism backed by the Russian Orthodox Church. In China, ruled by an atheistic Leninist party. In Iran, radical Shiite Islam. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez's 21st century socialism. And in Saudi Arabia, traditional Sunni Islamic monarchy. Yet most of these countries have been increasing their levels of mutual collaboration, both by establishing new organizations and by working with one another in long-established intergovernmental agencies. To repeat, today's autocracies obviously are not united by a joint allegiance to any universalist ideology, the way the communists were during the Cold War. They are brought together instead by a common hostility to liberal democracy. In a recent article, former Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev referred to them as the Anti-Democracy International. And they did not really worry too much about external invasion by democratic powers, despite what Putin sometimes says. What really scares them is the prospect that successful liberal democracies in their own regions will offer an attractive model for their domestic opponents. Indeed, the rulers of the leading authoritarian powers have explicitly stated their concern that liberal democratic ideas will infect their societies and lead to internal efforts to overthrow their regimes. The Chinese have been especially clear about this. Still, I think it's wrong to conclude that these regimes, because they don't subscribe to a common ideology, are not linked by any shared notions of how government should be run. This point was forcefully argued by Robert Kagan in a prescient 2008 book entitled The Return of History and the End of Dreams, in which he proclaimed that the world was heading to an era of growing tensions and sometimes confrontation between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy. In my own view, in the immediate post-Cold War period, I had thought that liberal democracy could be successfully challenged only by a powerful alternative ideology, and that apart from radical Islam, which obviously had limited appeal, no such ideologies appeared to be on the horizon. Kagan, however, contended that Chinese and Russian leaders are not just autocrats, they believe in autocracy. And by this he meant not a modern-style mobilizational ideology, but a form of government with a long history that emphasizes the importance of unified and centralized government, of order and stability, and of the strong rule at home that is needed for nations to be strong and well-respected internationally. Kagan predicted, and I quote, "The global competition between democratic and autocratic governments will become a dominant feature of the 21st century world." I don't think too many people were saying that in 2008, although it's very common now. And so far, at least, he seems to have been proven correct. The real question is what form that competition is going to take. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there can no longer be any doubt that autocratic powers present a grave security challenge to the democratic world. But there's a kind of asymmetry here. In the rivalry between autocrats and democrats, the biggest threat to the authoritarians is in the realm of ideas and information. The biggest threat to the democracies, on the other hand, is in the military and security sphere. China, Russia, and Iran, the three most powerful authoritarian regimes, are also the most aggressive internationally, and they possess, or in the case of Iran, are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. The democracies have been slow to recognize the gravity of the security threat that they increasingly face, but Putin's invasion of Ukraine has awakened them to the dangers ahead. To a considerable extent, they seem to have learned the lessons Putin has unwittingly taught them, and they seem prepared to increase their military spending and preparedness. It remains to be seen, however, how long these new attitudes will prevail, especially if the conflict in Ukraine turns into a protracted stalemate. The brave Ukrainian resistance to Putin's invasion has inspired many people in the democratic world, as we've seen here already today, and has given them a sharper sense of what's at stake in responding to the authoritarian challenge. Ukrainians constantly affirm that they are not simply defending their native soil, though they are certainly doing that, but they are fighting to secure their right to govern themselves and to live in freedom. The geopolitical competition is at the same time a conflict over contending moral and political principles. As our colleague Guy Anodia, who I see here and who's on the next panel, as he wrote in 2014 of the struggle for Ukraine's future direction that had already long been underway, quote, "One cannot say where democracy promotion ends and geopolitics begins. They are inseparable," close quote. This suggests that the foreign policy of the liberal democracies in confronting the authoritarian challenge needs to proceed both at the level of geopolitics and at the level of ideas. For the most part, the defense of our security interests and the defense of democracy complement each other. But it has to be acknowledged that there are sometimes serious tensions between them. These are most acute in our dealings with countries whose cooperation is needed for security reasons, but who fail to measure up in terms of democracy. And this raises, once again, an old and familiar story. During the Cold War, it was sometimes referred to as the issue of friendly tyrants, what we do about undemocratic regimes, but that supported us in the Cold War. Dealing with this kind of issue can require unpleasant compromises. Nearly everyone accepts that in a situation of truly dire jeopardy, where the survival of democracy itself is at stake, it may be necessary to swallow our revulsion at partnering with regimes that we abhor. And the classic example, of course, is the World War II alliance between the democracies and Stalin's Soviet Union. And as Churchill famously put it, if Hitler invaded hell, he would be ready to ally with the devil. But less extreme cases raise much thornier questions. My guess is that in the coming years, a number of these will center upon India, which is increasingly viewed as a backsliding or a liberal democracy, perhaps headed toward authoritarianism. Yet because of its size and its key location in the Indo-Pacific, it's generally regarded as an absolutely essential partner in the effort to counter authoritarian China. India was a participant at Biden's Democracy Summit, and it's hard to imagine that it will be excluded from future global democracy initiatives, or that excluding it would serve the long-term goal of advancing democracy. So to conclude, confronting the authoritarian challenge will demand from the liberal democracies not only firmness and resolve, the two qualities that are perhaps most needed, but also nimble diplomacy and an intelligent assessment of the inevitable trade-offs that defending democracy entails. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark Plattner, for your eloquent remarks that add up with different angles to what we already heard, and that break the ground for further and deeper analysis of our topic. So now I would turn to William Galston for his intervention. Please.
Well, thank you very much. At the beginning of this conference, you heard a distressingly long list of people who had been prevented by unexpected circumstances from joining us today. And I am a last-minute fill-in for one of those unfortunate people. And so that makes it not only appropriate, but necessary for me to deliver brief remarks. Having just promised brevity, let me begin on two personal notes. Note one, a few minutes ago, we heard a very optimistic quotation from a great philosopher and a great Sephardi Jew, certainly Sephardi, we can argue about the noun, to the effect that in free and open societies, it was impossible for large numbers of people to come to believe in absurdities. Speaking as an American, I can report 10 years ago, I would have agreed with Spinoza. Now, I am not so sure. And I think we should all be cautious of the bedtime stories that we tell ourselves about the immunity of open societies, to doctrines and assertions that are self-evidently false and absurd. It is, unfortunately, a vulnerability of democracies under modern conditions, and I think we must recognize that. A second personal note, we heard some remarkable statistics at the beginning of this meeting about the past 30 years. From 40 to 400 students in the political studies program, a tenfold increase. And from 20 to 600 participants in this political forum, the 30th edition, a 30-fold increase, appropriately enough. Now, I absolutely agree that these developments were not the product of a plot or conspiracy. The additional point I'd like to make is that they didn't happen by accident either. And I yield to no one in my admiration for the power of ideas, but I have noticed in my now long life that ideas neither speak nor act for themselves. These statistics are the product not only of a great team, but also to the vision, the resolve, and persistence of one man, Professor Spada, and I think we should all recognize and salute him for his 30 years of service to this cause. I want to make one point in my remarks, and it represents an expansion of something the distinguished statesman to my right, your left, said in his remarks. I don't know whether he's to my right or to my left, but that's a different question. There are two kinds of threats to liberal democracy today. There is the external threat, as witnessed by the central theme of this conference, namely the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what it means and what to do about it. This is a conflict, by the way, that another potential external aggressor, China, is watching very carefully. If Ukraine fails, and if we fail to do everything we can to support Ukraine, the fate of Taiwan, which already is in jeopardy, I believe will be further jeopardized. So we have, in doing our duty to Ukraine, we are also doing our duty to other democracies that stand in the way of an external aggressor. But the other principal autocratic threat to democracy is from within. And I will confess that I am more worried about the internal threat than I am about the external threat. I think we have a pretty good idea of what we need to do about the external threat. The question is whether or not we'll choose to do it. The internal threat, I believe, is an intellectual and moral challenge of greater complexity. And I want to argue that these two threats are linked. Our capacity to defend democracy from external aggression in the long run will be no stronger than the strength of our democracies and our commitment to them at home. I do not think it is an accident, comrades, that resistance to the strengthening of NATO and the European Union have come from the member nations of these important organizations whose relationship to liberal democracy is somewhat more attenuated than for most other members. I could go into further details on that point, but I think it would be diplomatically dangerous for me to do so. I want us to focus for just a minute on some of the trends in liberal democracies that challenge the strength of democratic institutions and, in some respects, internal commitment to those institutions. And I want to put on the table 5 sources of democratic weakness because I think they constitute a kind of agenda for reflection and action within democracies that we ignore at our peril. Number 1 is the economic. It surely has escaped few in this room that the principal challenges to liberal democracy have come not from the great capital cities of Europe and the United States, but from the areas that I will call the peripheries, more rural, less densely populated areas, and also areas where we've seen the declining strength of the manufacturing sector and industrial workers. And it is from the disappointments experienced by those geographical sectors that I believe some of the greatest discontent with established democratic institutions has come and will continue to come. And if we ignore the legitimate complaints of those areas, we are asking for trouble, and we have already gotten it, and we will continue to get it. That's point number one. Number two, the realm of culture. We are Western democracies, most democracies are culturally diverse. And how one handles potentially divisive cultural issues is a very delicate matter. There are certain basics that must be uniform and secured to all. But if we go beyond that, and some observers believe that in the cultural sphere, for example, the European Union has gone beyond that, that will be experienced by many people as the effort to impose someone else's culture on their own beliefs. As I said, that is sometimes necessary, but it is necessary, I believe, less frequently than it occurs. Again, I could go into details. Third source of internal democratic weakness, political failure. And by political failure, I have in mind two things. First of all, the perceived inability of political leaders and established institutions to address urgent public problems. If problems are left to stagnate because leaders cannot, and political parties that dominate a scene of a country cannot get together to solve those problems, that incapacity tends to bring democracy into discredit among people who are rightly demanding change, but sadly are not getting it. Second kind of political failure is inadequate representation of certain groups within society. And I'm not just talking about people who historically have been left at the threshold of the door of democracy, like too many minority groups in my country for too long. I am also talking about people who are left underrepresented when political leaders turn their attention elsewhere. It is, I think, widely recognized that that in many Western democracies, left-leaning political parties have turned away from working-class concerns in the direction of more educated professionals, leaving those concerns without responsible representation in the political system. And as a result, that vacuum is being filled by irresponsible representation of that group. And this is something that requires reflection and correction, particularly on the parties that are left of center, the historic homes of working-class voters. Fourth, destabilizing demographic change, which can come about as the result of external factors such as immigration or internal factors like the collapse of fertility, which is now affecting the entire world of Western democracies and will make it increasingly difficult to maintain either the European or the American social model. And finally, and here I have my own country, but also countries like India in mind, religious divisions. If they are not handled very carefully, if religious majorities seek to impose their will on religious minorities, the result will be violence, and always has been, and always will. As in the sphere of culture, a preference for tolerance, for the capacious coexistence of difference is essential. That is one of the things that I think of when I think of open societies. And to the extent that that capacious tolerance does not characterize our real practices as opposed to our declaratory stances, we have a problem, and so does democracy. And that and I address this particular to the students, the hundreds of students at this conference, that is an agenda of internal strengthening of democracy that should occupy us all, but will only be dealt with well after all of the people on this platform pass from the stage. We have identified these problems, but it will be your task to solve them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for your remarks, calling to order important questions and points that have to be stressed. As we move ahead in this round of challenging sharing of ideas, it is now time, I think, to look at these contributions as a whole, for they create an inspiring, substantive insight, feeding important elements to this afternoon's debate. We have now, I hope, a wider picture with many faces, with contradictions and loose ends that feature possible answers to the question that is addressed today to us. But I know that time is getting short, and I won't be forgiven if I don't open the floor before asking for concluding remarks, open the floor for some comments or questions if the audience has them. Yes. Yes, you need a microphone, and I will ask you to identify yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Flather. I wanted to pick up on the point of India, which is actually my original homeland. And I'm so glad that several speakers have brought that to our attention. Before I do, I want to just share one remark. I shared it with Bill yesterday. I was listening to an interview with Henry Kissinger, who's celebrating his 100th year. Remarkable life he's had. And he made so many interesting points, but I'm just going to share you with one. And he said that the 21st century might be the century where democracies and authoritarian regimes will have to live side by side. In other words, he was making the point, you better get used to it. I see if people want to comment on that. Now, on India, and I've mentioned this in advance to Professor Zhao Espada, I think we should have had more focus on India, so I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, there are 5 reasons why India quite wrongly and quite deliberately did not vote to sanction Russia. Number 1, it's always felt loyalty to Russia. From the time that Nehru, even before he became prime minister, he had good relations with Russia. Russia was always there to help it, and Mrs. Gandhi confirmed that in a friendship treaty in 71. Number 2, Russia supplies, as we all know, a lot of weapons to India. So it's worried that in its confrontation with China and other bodies, it can't lose that supply line of repairs and munitions and so on. Number 3, China is very close to Pakistan, which is its ideological opponent. Number 4, there's this mindset in India where it doesn't want to be told what to do. So sometimes it just is irritatingly different. It doesn't want us to say which way we should go. And number 5, and maybe Bill will say something about this, I think Indians do feel that despite the burgeoning relationship with America, it's still a fickle relationship. And they had the row of a nuclear support and so on. So those are the reasons. My point is that India believes it's acting its own self-interest. What it should be doing is joining the group, the commonness, the common feeling against authoritarianism.
Thank you. I think that we have time for another question, and then I will ask the speakers to answer. I see you there. I'm sorry. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hello. I had 2 questions to the panel, anyone who would be willing to answer them. The first question is, in your opinion, if we're facing a prolonged war in Ukraine, how likely is it that the West would get militarily involved? Also regarding the food crisis that might be coming up in the not too distant future. And also, regarding the United States internal politics. What should be the role of Europe and the rest of the world's democracies if in 2024 America elects an isolationist president? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask the panel who would like to? Yes, first, José Manuel.
I've raised the issue of democracy of India precisely because I wanted to make clear that this issue of Ukraine is not just about democracy versus authoritarianism, which is or autocracy or totalitarianism. It's beyond that. It's about the international order because we have democracies, of course not perfect, but you have such an important democracy like India or South Africa, another important South Africa post-apartheid, that did not take the position that at least some of us, not me, I have to say, were expecting them to take. For me, I was not at all surprised to see the position of India. In fact, I would be surprised if they have taken the position of supporting the United States or supporting Europe. For the reason you mentioned, Paul, not the first reasons, that of course they exist, but long-standing relations with Russia, also the issue of Pakistan and so on. But the real issue for India, at least Modi's India, is that they believe the source of their problems are in many centuries of Muslim domination and at least 2 centuries of European colonial rule. And the resentment against Europe and the West is huge in India. So the idea that India is going to become be part of a kind of a NATO in Asia Pacific, I think it's completely naive. I fully understand the advantage of no longer being in politics, that you can be much more frank and open. So I'm no longer in politics. The reality is that the moves taken by the current administration in the United States, and indeed it was not only this one, it started in some previous administrations, to involve more India, namely as a way to create some barrage against China. The Indians are going to do it to some extent because, as you said, Paul, they believe it's in their self-interest. But from there, to go to a position of aligning with the so-called community of democracies, forget about it. Not because, I will not be so unfair to say, because their position is purely transactional about their own position, but because they sincerely believe, at least the elite, the political leaders in India, that their interest is not to be aligning with the West. Their interest is to continue to play some middle ground. They will, of course, and that's why they are in the Quad, created by the United States, working with other democracies in the Asia-Pacific region. They are there, but they will not go to the point of aligning their foreign policy with the West. That's my sincere assessment. Not in the foreseeable future, at least. What happens in the long term, as you know, in the long term, we are all dead. Having said that, in the foreseeable future, the position of India will be one of trying, above all, to keep a high level of autonomy. And this is also favored by the current orientation of the current leader of India, who is strongly nationalistic, also from a cultural and, by the way, religious point of view, as was highlighted by William and also by others. So I think this critical issue of India is critically important because India is going to be very soon the biggest country in the planet in terms of population. And so we have to see where they are going. The other question, I mean, until now, the position of the West, the NATO typically, has been to support Ukraine, but try to avoid, of course, a direct military confrontation with Russia. It's a balance difficult to keep, because the reality is that Ukraine is benefiting from training, intelligence, military supply of military weapons, and also, besides, of course, all the political, diplomatic, and financial support. So, in fact, the West is supporting very, very strongly Ukraine. Now, is it possible that it goes beyond that, that we have a direct, open conflict between NATO or the West and Russia? Yes, it is possible, but I believe that's not at all what both sides, NATO and Russia, want. And that's why, for instance, President Biden has been very clear sometimes when there were some misperceptions of what he said or some kind of remarks that, no, that's not the goal. That's not the goal. Why? To avoid, of course, an escalation that could be an even bigger tragedy than the one we have so far. So this is where we are, but it's an unstable balance. And as always, there are risks. There are risks of escalation and there are risks of accident. Sometimes wars happen by accident, as we know from history. So that's why it is extremely important to define precisely the goals of the different actors. And for me, to be honest, but that will be for another discussion, not today, that's not clear. I have the privilege of being in contact with many of these global players, and when I ask what is the end game, where you believe we are going to come, there is not a clear answer. There is, of course, a diplomatic answer, is we have to leave that to our Ukrainian friends. They are the ones who are fighting, so they have to decide. Okay, I can understand that. But I still want to ask myself, what is the end game of this situation? Frankly, I think most of us do not know. We know that we should keep to support Ukraine, but sooner or later we have to have peace. And Russia is a fact, whether we like it or not. So what is the end game? Not clear from my point of view. The other issue that you mentioned, what if we have another kind of presidency in the United States? Recently I was in the United States, in Washington. I spoke with many people at the highest level in Washington. And myself and other Europeans, we have put that question to our American friends. And all of them, without exception, I don't know if our two friends from the United States are in this panel, agree with me or not, but, or agree with what they told me or not, but all of them said the following. First, they did not deny the risk of having someone like Trump as president of the United States. They said it can happen, even Trump coming back. And they see it as a risk, and I also see it as a risk from a transatlantic point of view, because the level of complicity, of coordination that we have today in the United States, of course, will be very damaging. We have heard President Trump having very nice remarks about Putin, at the same time criticizing the European leaders constantly. So this is not the good way to create some confidence. Having said that, also they have always highlighted, and I think it is important and to some extent reassuring, that until now we have seen a remarkable bipartisan support to the positions taken by the United States on this war. And this is, of course, is reassuring. So that in spite of the extremely polarized situation in the American system that we have today, where it's hard to find some points of convergence between the most important parties, at least when it comes to some of these geostrategic issues, we have seen a great deal of convergence, including in the votes on the Congress. So let's hope that, of course, we'll have, on the American side, I'm concluding, and also on the European side, because we have to be also self-critical. Is Europe going to sustain its position over time? Let's hope, but I'm not completely sure. Let's hope that we show the staying power, the sustainable position on both sides of the Atlantic to fight for justice, because it's also to fight for our own survival in these very difficult times.
Mark,
Yes.
we're really...
I'll try to be very brief. I think this is a time...
Red lights are flashing from the rulers of the... No, but please, go ahead.
Time of really great uncertainty. In Ukraine, so much depends on what will happen on the battlefield. And it makes it very hard to say what the diplomacy should be without knowing that. And for the situation in the United States, there too. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in 2024. And yes, I think there is some likelihood. I think probably a little less than half that Trump or someone like him will win. but exactly what that would mean and under what circumstances it would come to pass is just so hard to know. I just wanted to say one other thing, that several people pointed, in the case of India, but elsewhere too, of countries not liking to be lectured. And I think in recent years, this is something those of us who have worked in democracy promotion have been more and more struck with. People who once welcomed agents of democracy, spokesmen for democracy, now say, we don't want to be lectured to. And in the case of some of the countries that Dr. Barroso mentioned, it's against their own interests because they're democratic countries, and if democracy fails, they fail with it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And William, would you like to add something very concise? I'm sorry. I'm being watched.
I believe I've already demonstrated a capacity for brevity, and I'll try to maintain my reputation. I will deal with only one of the three questions on the table, the most political of the three questions, at least in the narrow sense. First of all, I think it is a reasonable assessment that there is a 50% chance, unless current circumstances in the United States improve considerably, that not only someone like former President Trump, but indeed someone very like former President Trump, namely President Trump himself, will re-enter the Oval Office. And I believe that we all have to recognize, that America is not the stable, immovable rock on which Europe counted for so many decades. We have to face that fact. And it's going to make life much more difficult, for the leaders of Portugal, all the members of the European Union, and others to build stable and sustainable policies. I agree that there has been substantial bipartisan unity on Ukraine so far, but I think we must all recognize that Ukraine is not the totality of the relationship, other aspects of which will be harder to maintain. We should also keep in mind that support for Ukraine, both in the United States and in Europe, could well be a wasting asset. It could be a very cold winter here in Europe. What will happen then? The American Congress 2 months ago recently voted a $40 billion aid package for Ukraine. Even for our economy, that is, and I will clean up Mr. Biden's normal locution, a big deal. And I can tell you that many people inside the administration are skeptical that another such package will be authorized. So time is not necessarily on Ukraine's side, and that worries me deeply because I think Mr. Putin believes what I just said, that time is not on Ukraine's side. And I believe his capacity to keep on doing what he's doing may be longer than our capacity to keep on doing what we're doing. That worries me.
Thank you. Thank you for all these very wise words. Certainly many questions remain open, but I am sure that what was said contribute to enrich what is always an unfinished debate, because peace, democracy, the values and goals we share are never granted, and they have a price. Political will, the energy and responsibility of civil society are the major drivers to achieve results. We need awareness to stay awake, alert, and vigilant, for we learn that we need an ongoing, never-ending effort to build a better future. We need it from everybody, all generations, but I'm happy that we are addressing today the young generation, because the future is yours. So, and last remark, please, let's keep a bit of optimism and confidence, and let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have here two two big quotations, one of Spinoza concerning rationality and rule of law, second, imperfection of Montaigne, and we must understand this. Thank you very much.
And now we break for tea, right? We break for tea.